Okay.
Bom dia a todas e a todos. É um prazer tê-los conosco em mais esse evento do Centro Brasileiro de Estudos Durkheimianos. E hoje nós temos o prazer de receber aqui Paul Carlos, que vai nos apresentar uma palestra intitulada O Estudo dos Fatos Morais, que tem a ver com as pesquisas que ele anda desenvolvendo. Eu vou, de imediato aqui, passar a palavra para André Manielli, para que ele continue aqui o expediente do dia. André, está com você a bola.
Bom dia, Rafael. Muito obrigado a todos. Vou falar em inglês, um inglês precário, para que a gente consiga fazer uma comunicação entre os pares. Paul Carlos, Sebastian Raza, que falam inglês. Meu inglês é precário, mas, digamos, funcional. Hello, everybody. Good morning. I am André Manielli, founder, researcher and director of the Independent and Networked Institution of Studies and Research, Ateliê de Humanidades. Since one of our main goals is to make the connections between university, civil society, and the public sphere, the first event in partnership with the Centro Brasileiro de Estudos Durkheimianos, the Brazilian Center of Durkheimian Studies, is another important step in this direction. I thank Raquel Weiss and Rafael Benson for the invitation and friendship. My work here will be greatly reduced. I will only introduce the participants and distribute the speech in collaboration with Raquel Weiss. Let me quickly introduce the proposal of the event and the participants. The lecture takes as its starting point Paul Carl's article, The Study of Moral Facts, the initial theoretical methodological chapter for the book Multiculturalism and the Nation in Germany, a study on moral conflict, which will soon be published by Routledge. I start by introducing the members of the table and welcoming them. Raquel Weiss, Sebastian Raza, and Carlos Fabris. Then I introduce the speaker, Paul Carlos, and already give him the word. Along with me, we have Raquel Weiss, who has a doctorate, PhD, in philosophy from Universidade de São Paulo, and is associate professor at the sociology department and the postgraduate program sociology at Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul. Raquel Weiss is coordinator of the Centro Brasileiro de Estudos Durkheimianos with Rafael Benson and associate researcher at the British Centre for Durkheimian Studies, University of Oxford. She is, with Rafael Benson, the coordinator of the collection Biblioteca Durkheimiana, a biblioteca collection published by the Universidade de São Paulo, editora Universidade de São Paulo. Good morning, Raquel. Thank you very much for the proposal of this event and for your presence. And the second person is Sebastian Raza. Sebastian is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, where he specializes in social theory. His current research draws upon American pragmatism, moral philosophy, and contemporary social theory to propose a normative-oriented practice theoretic framework to analyze the moral, political, and temporal intricacies of experience of crisis. Sebastian Raza, good morning. Thanks for my invite, and it's possible with a profound, deeper for deepening our dialogue. Thanks, Sebastian. And with Sebastian, we have Carlos Fabris, master and doctor in doctoring in postgraduate program in sociology at the Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul. He is a full member of the Brazilian Center for Durkheimian Studies. Good morning, Carlos Fabris. And now, Paul Kaus' presentation. Paul Kaus holds a PhD in political science from the University of Montreal and was a postdoctoral research associate at the Luxemburgo Institute of Socioeconomic Research. He has published work on the life and work of Durkheim, European and North American politics, and has a special interest in the sociology of morality. Good morning, and thank you, Paul Kaus, for the possibility to debate your test. Raquel Weiss, do you want to prolongate the presentation of Paul Kaus, speak any more?
I wanted to say hi, everyone. It's an honor for us to receive you this morning. Paul contacted us to share about his work, as somehow we are working on the same issues. So every time we have this opportunity to meet someone who are interested in the same issues that we are, is always a joy. And we decided together to have this session of conversation, of debating his arguments, this chapter for the new book. And we invited Sebastian Raza and Carlos Fabris to make a more organized, a deep debate. And after, we are going to open to a more broad conversation. The idea is that anyone who is interested in the topic that can address comments and exchange ideas. It's a very informal section of our center, but overall, the idea is have some quality time to go deep into these ideas on Durkheim moral theory, and to try to think how we can use this theory to understand contemporary world and how we can do sociology based on those ideas. So I believe Paul offers us a great point of departure to do so. And as André mentioned, Paul is going to deliver his speech first, and then we have our two guests to discuss, and then we have this conversation. Again, a very informal session, and I welcome everyone this morning. For you, it's not morning, it's afternoon, but anyway, for us here, it's 9 a.m. And I wish everyone a good session. I apologize, I won't be able to keep my camera open all the time, as my baby has some health issues, and I will have to take care of her in a few moments. So in order to don't distract you, I will keep the camera off in a few moments, but I will be here all the time. So I wish you everyone a good session. So please, Paul, you have the floor.
Okay, yes, thank you. As I think Raquel said, it's always exciting to meet people who are doing research, similar research, and I guess with Durkheim it's somewhat particular because for a variety of reasons, historical and otherwise, Durkheim is not, I think, as popular as he should be. And so, yeah, to find other people doing Durkheimian work, especially on morality, and using it in a fruitful way in a contemporary context is rather rare, and I would say makes me happy. So I'll just say that. And I also just want to thank the organizers here for inviting me, for organizing the conference, and it seems as if Brazil is one of the places where Durkheimian sociology has taken root, and that's very good to see. So I'm happy to be making this presentation with the Brazilian Center for Durkheim Studies. And so yeah, hopefully I have a good presentation, we have a good debate, and I guess I'll do my presentation now. I'm assuming that people participating have read my text, so I will try and sort of go over the main points. I also have a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to try to do a share screen so that, let's see, is it possible to do, okay, I have to set up the share screen here. Let's see. All right. Are you all seeing the PowerPoint? Does everything look good? I can't see the video screen anymore, so I just have to hear what you say.
Yes, we can see. It's perfect. The only thing is not fully open. It's not on the presentation mode. We see the small screens.
Ah, I see.
You see your screen.
Let's see. Does it work now?
Not yet.
No. Let's see.
Maybe a slideshow.
I don't know what happens. Sometimes you have to close the document and reopen it.
I see.
I don't know why, but sometimes it's what you got to do.
All right. Try
Technology
again here.
is always a problem. We never hit on the first time.
Well, I mean, in all honesty, the PowerPoint's not really so important. It serves.
But anyway, we can
play
see.
slideshow. Yes.
Okay, so the PowerPoint is working now.
We can see, but not on the presentation mode. But it's okay if you can pass in a.
Well, whatever.
We are able to see.
I'll just try.
It's not a problem. It's not a problem.
Okay. Well, anyway, well, the title of my presentation is has to do with the study of moral facts, but I would say it's also very much intertwined with this the question of using Durkheim to study power, politics, and conflict. And I think there's a view of Durkheim among political scientists, especially, and also perhaps philosophers and sociologists, that Durkheim doesn't really have much to say about power, politics, and conflict. And so one of the things that I tried to do in this theoretical chapter is to show quite the opposite, is that Durkheim actually offers quite useful analytical tools to study power, domination, conflict. And I think there's certain key concepts in Durkheim's work that allow us to do that. And some of those, I think probably the most important is the idea of legitimate authority, and also the associated concept of charisma. And I developed those in the chapter. And in a lot of ways, I tried to draw parallels between Durkheim and Weber. And Weber, I think, is often sort of the standard reference when it comes to studying legitimate authority or charisma, for example. And I'm hoping to change that to some extent. Hopefully I can bring Durkheim more into the discussion on those issues. And yeah, so it's Well, I'll get into more of the comparison between Durkheim and Weber later on in my presentation. But I think Durkheim offers a more interesting and nuanced approach to the question of authority or charisma or conflict. And yeah, so what I'm trying to do is to just sort of reinvigorate Durkheim's sociology, to bring out its core elements in a way that I haven't seen anyone else do before, and to try and reinvigorate interest into Durkheim's work as an alternative to perhaps Max Weber or Michel Foucault, for example. And I'll get into that a little bit more in the presentation. And I guess one last thing I should mention before beginning is that, and I think Raquel, she mentioned it in the email that she sent around, and I mentioned it, I don't know if it's in the chapter, but it's in the introduction of my book, is my view of society for Durkheim. And for a lot of people, Durkheim is someone who has sort of a monolithic vision of society. A society is an integrated whole, and within it, there are no conflicts, there are no struggles for power, things like that. And so that's one thing I had to modify in his work, and I did that drawing off of Randall Collins, and he has this definition of society, which is any period of association between individuals in any prolonged period of time. And so when you break down Durkheim's concept of society and you use it to study subgroups or competing groups that share the same social space, for example, a nation state, or then you can do social conflict, and you can develop a Durkheimian theory of social or moral conflict. And so I think that's what I've done. I think Randall Collins, that really is an important component of what I'm doing, is that shift in how we understand what a society is when Durkheim talks about society. So with that, I'll just go into, I'm not sure if you can see the shift in the slides, but anyway. So in the book, there are, I think, 4 major themes, or in this chapter, there are 4 major themes that I develop, and these are all related to what I'm talking about earlier, the reinvigoration of the Durkheimian paradigm. And the first theme is collective representations as social facts. And this is, yeah, I'll go into each of these themes into much more detail later on. But that's one of the major themes. It's one of the major sections of the paper. There's also the idea of legitimate authority, which is another major theme that I develop. And there's a section on that in the paper, but also if you understand moral authority as the pure sacred, then there's an entire, now Durkheim's entire sociology of religion is also tied to this idea of legitimate authority. And then there's the idea of the construction of moral knowledge. And this is mostly when I do an analysis of the moral fact. And and here, I guess, I use the word knowledge very explicitly, and because you're talking about a network of truths, and they're different from scientific truths, but they still constitute truths that people live their lives by. And in that sense, I would consider it a form of knowledge that creates epistemic frameworks of moral truths, moral judgments, moral values. And you find all of that, again, this is all just based directly off of Durkheim's work. And so that's another theme. And the final theme of the paper is the idea of the Durkheimian ideal type. And here again, I guess I'm sort of borrowing terminology from Max Weber, who is, of course, the standard reference. And nevertheless, in Durkheim's work, you have language that basically mirrors the idea of an ideal type. He talks about moral ideas. He talks about types of thought and behavior. So I don't think it's really too much of a stretch to talk about the Durkheimian ideal type. And I developed this idea mostly in the last section where I talk about the moral ideals of the community. And overall, the book that I've written, and also the chapter that you've read, what I'm elaborating is a structuralist paradigm. And I guess this is a Durkheimian structuralist paradigm. It's not structuralist in the sense of talking about material or economic structures, I guess, as you would maybe in the Marxist sense, or even perhaps if you look at the earlier Durkheim in the division of labor, you have certain social structures. What I'm talking about is more along the lines of ideational structures. And so I'm talking about the structures of thought, the structure of moral decision-making. And when you do that, you have the structure of ideas. And I'm also using the idea of structure here in the sense of Jacques Derrida, sort of what he critiques as the structuralist paradigm. And so he has this he's one of the founders of the post-structural movement. And so it might seem strange to say after post-structuralism, I'm advocating a structuralist paradigm, but that's what I'm doing. The structuralist paradigm, I think, is the correct one. I think post-structuralism is something of the past, and so I'm hoping to convince people here and in the future that the Durkheim structuralist paradigm is useful to the study of social behavior, and so those are the main themes. And so I'll just begin going through talking about these major themes in more detail. And so there's the idea of collective representations as social facts. And the main point that I argue in the chapter is that ideas are part of the nature. They can be studied empirically, and they have causal efficiency. And this is sort of where Durkheim, I think, is a very interesting author, because he splits between different schools of thought, positivism and idealism, or naturalism and idealism. And you have these ideas, as I mentioned in the paper, they're the product of the sui generis fusion of individual minds, which takes place in ritual. And so even though ideas are not material, they're not material objects, they are a part of nature. They are the product of this social interaction process. And so they can be studied empirically, and also the idea that they have causal efficiency. What I point out in the paper is that through ritual, which is what gives birth to ideas, you have the creation also of sui generis collective emotions. And so to certain ideas, you have emotional attachments. People have emotional attachments to certain ideas, moral ideas, ideas of beauty, ideas of truth. So people have these emotional attachments. And when the idea comes to mind, it causes an individual to act, to behave in a certain way. And so this is where the causal efficiency, the causal efficacy of ideas comes from. And so these are all points that I drew out in the paper, and this is basically the foundation of Durkheim's social realism, which again is founded in this idea of sui generis. And I think the idea is, and this is kind of maybe where I differ a little bit from other people in the Durkheim community when I look at Durkheim's sociology of knowledge. A lot of the discussion in secondary literature when it comes to Durkheim's sociology of knowledge is focused on the categories. And that's section 4 of the conclusion of the elementary forms. And there you have him talking about the categories of space and time, number and causality, the category of totality. These are all used in logical thought. They're very important. But in the secondary literature, it's almost completely ignored Durkheim's analysis of concepts, the origin of concepts. That's section 3 of the elementary forms. And this is, it's very unfortunate in my mind that it's an ignored part of Durkheim's work, because it's such a fascinating way to look at ideas. The idea, and I use, in my paper, I use the example of the formation of language, where you have two individuals who are both observing an object of reality. We can call it a rock, but they both have subjective perceptions of the rock. But if they want to communicate with each other about the rock and share those experiences, they have to sort of fuse their individual perceptions together into a stable concept. And they'll give it a name, they'll call it a rock. And the rock abstracts from individual experience. It's also something that can be shared amongst individuals and across time. And it's something that the concept, when you look at the formation of language in that sense, it's impossible to reduce it to individuals. It's something sui generis in the perfect sense. It cannot be reduced to its individual composing parts. It's something that is completely different from its composing parts. It's a new entity completely. And I think that's probably the strongest proof of Durkheim's idea of social facts as sui generis. And there's still, unfortunately, in sociology, I think there's still a lot of methodological individualists, and there's still a lot of people who deny that social facts or social objects exist. And I think this is really
Paul, I guess we lost you. At least I cannot hear.
Se minha imagem está parada, Raquel.
O Paul caiu, né? Um instante, pessoal, deixa o Paul retornar.
De repente a gente aproveita e fala também da questão do PowerPoint, talvez como não está dando para passar, talvez seja o caso de tirar, que a imagem fica maior.
Uhum. Sim, sim. Pessoal, fique à vontade de fazer perguntas, tá? Que eu vou fazer no final. Okay? Feel free to ask questions. We will have we will make the questions in final of the presentation. Ele não conseguiu retornar. Talvez ele não tenha nem percebido, hein, Raquel? Que ele caiu.
Eu acho
não, agora
que
caiu mesmo. Agora caiu mesmo. Sim.
Sim, porque a imagem está fechada e o microfone também talvez esteja voltando. Dei uma olhada no YouTube, então, mais de 20 pessoas seguindo aqui.
Não desistam, pessoal, de assistir, que ele está voltando, tá? Aí está aproveitando o momento, eu quero agradecer a presença do Efraim, do Rodrigo, da Clarice, o próprio Rafael também está no YouTube, né? Glauco, Maciele, Eduardo, Elissa, Silvia, Ana Carolina, Caroline, Ana Karine e Clarice. Uma forte representação de um público interessado no Durkheim, né? E, obviamente, no trabalho Paul Caus sobre Durkheim.
Acho que Paul talvez tenha conseguido voltar agora.
Paul?
Não.
Enquanto o Paul não volta...
ele está conectando o áudio.
Estou conectando. Tá.
Mas você ia falar alguma coisa, André?
Enquanto ele conecta, tá? Raquel, quando você achar que ele está conectado, você avisa. Queria só, então, fazer duas divulgações, né? Uma delas é sugerir fortemente que vocês conheçam a coleção Durkheimiana, publicada pela editora da Universidade de São Paulo. É um trabalho original, brilhante, no contexto mundial mesmo, não só no contexto brasileiro. Não tem precedentes, até onde eu sei, em outras propostas. Em outras propostas de outras editoras, a publicação de textos clássicos vinculados à pesquisa do Durkheim, e então não tem só texto do Durkheim, mas também dos grupos de pesquisa em torno da coleção Durkheimiana, do L'Année Sociologique, e é editora de publicações bilíngues com um dossiê. É uma forte proposição editorial que faz uma contribuição muito importante para a recepção do Durkheim e do grupo L'Année Sociologique no Brasil. Paul, já está me escutando, Paul? E a segunda proposição que eu queria fazer é de vocês conhecerem um livro que a gente publicou, Raquel Weiss, eu e o Jaime Gomes Neto, nós organizamos. Também teve artigo do Marcelo de Oliveira, teve uma introdução que a gente fez sobre os estudos durkheimianos no Brasil, o estado da arte. Nesse livro, que é o Durkheim, apesar do século, foi publicado pela Ana Bloom, infelizmente teve problema de distribuição. Esperamos publicar em algum momento uma segunda edição que supra essa carência editorial que foi posta pela falta de distribuição pela Ana Bloom. A gente vem a publicar pela Ateliê de Humanidades editorial, mas enquanto vocês não têm acesso a esse livro, vocês conseguem encontrar na internet. No meu perfil academia.edu, vocês conseguem encontrar em PDF o livro Durkheim, apesar do século. Interpretações entre filosofia e sociologia. É um livro que eu creio que ajuda também a ter várias facetas, interpretações do Durkheim nessa interface entre filosofia e sociologia em diálogo com os intérpretes contemporâneos, tanto franceses quanto também do mundo anglo-saxônico. Então, fica essas duas sugestões, coleção Durkheimiana e Durkheim, apesar do século. De Paul, nada, né? Apareceu. Paul?
Sim, tá aqui. Paul.
Paul.
Yeah. I was wondering what happened.
Welcome back. I believe you could not see when you went down. Then we were making some publicity here somehow about the books that we organized while you were coming back. Okay. So welcome back. You can reassume.
Okay, so where was the last part that you heard? I talked about the strong program and interaction rituals.
You were beginning to
address
this topic. You were beginning to address this topic. Yeah.
Okay. Well, basically, I was just saying that I'm basically drawing off of both the strong program and the interaction ritual paradigm of Randall Collins, and they complement each other. And so the strong program focuses on ideas, and the causal autonomy of ideas. But the problem with that is that it doesn't explain the causal link. And so ideas and narratives and cultural structures, they can only have causal efficacy if people have an emotional attachment to them. And this is where the interaction ritual comes in, by focusing on the ritual, because the ritual is where these emotions are produced. And so they both sort of complement each other, and I draw for both of these paradigms, but at the same time, I just go back to Durkheim. And I think that's also the importance of Durkheim, is that you have in his work both. So the strong program and interaction ritual paradigm, they both make important contributions and developments in Durkheim's thought, but you can go back to Durkheim and you have almost everything already there. So that's what I was just trying to say. But I did want to mention that there is still a question. So if you have ideas as real objects of empirical study in society, the question is, is it possible to have an objective account for the meaning of collective representations? So this is the debate, I guess, between hermeneutics, the issue of hermeneutics. So if you admit that social facts are real, that ideas are sui generis products of social interaction, and that they can be studied empirically. And so that becomes an issue of positivism. You can study them empirically, but it becomes a hermeneutical issue because these ideas are full of meaning. They mean things. They tell people certain things. So you can say that the social fact exists objectively in social reality, but the question is, can you have an objectively valid account for the meaning of the social fact? And this is a critique that's been made. I think Charles Taylor is a prominent critique of the idea of objective meaning. Max Weber, of course, Dilthey. There's a long tradition in the hermeneutics of saying that there can be no objective facts in the social sciences, and so that's sort of the question. If we stay with the Durkheimian paradigm, we have objectively existing social facts. The question is, can we objectively identify their meaning? I don't know the answer to that. I would like to think that you can objectively identify the meaning, but I'll come back to that issue at the very end and propose what I think is a possible rebuttal to Charles Taylor and this tradition, this hermeneutical tradition. So I'll just come back to that later in the presentation at the end. So that's collective representations as social facts. Then there's the issue. The other main theme is legitimate authority, and here I'm basically drawing off of Durkheim's analysis of the moral fact. And here I'm also addressing the Weberian legacy in the social sciences. And I think Durkheim's theory is extremely useful for the study, especially of political phenomenon. But unfortunately, Weber is the standard reference, and I always thought that was kind of annoying in political science classes that Durkheim is never mentioned. But the issue with Weber, of course, I think it's a kind of standard criticism, is that his notion of authority is rooted in kind of it's a routine submission of power, and it only allows us to describe the effects of authority in a social realm, and it does not allow for the contemplation of values or the idea that the legitimacy of authority is rooted in something independent of the exercise of power. And I think that's kind of the standard criticism. An example would be that the authority of a politician is legitimate due to their charisma, but their power is derived from their charisma. And so it basically creates a tautology where you explain the authority of the individual by their charisma, but the charisma is also the source of their authority. So it can be rather limiting. The strength of Durkheim is that he has the idea of legitimate authority is rooted in values that are external to the source of power. And you have this with his whole theory of religion, his theory of ritual, the creation of the pure sacred in ritual. And the creation of the pure sacred as a moral authority, it allows for an account of authority that is anchored in values that are independent of the power itself. So, and this is, I think, the central insight into Durkheim's theory of power and conflict lies. It has to go through his theory of legitimate authority, because when you have different groups, for example, in the same society, and they both appeal to different moral authorities. They both have differing or contrasting visions of the good. What is right? What is wrong? What moral rules should we follow? If there are conflicts about that, they can then Durkheim is the perfect person to go to understand what's going on, and you have to go, and that'll necessarily imply a study of how do actors involved in these conflicts justify their positions? How do they legitimate their behavior? And it always goes back to this idea of moral authority that Durkheim articulates. And so I think that's very important. I think, and if you look at Durkheim's sociology, the idea of authority is probably one of the core concepts running throughout his work. And again, it's very regrettable that it's been so neglected over the years. But anyway, I should also mention that Durkheim's theory of legitimate authority is tied to his theory of charisma. And again, this forms a parallel with Weber. And I mentioned it in the paper, but an individual actor's charisma is derived from their association with the moral authority, basically. And so it depends on their ability to harness the collective forces that are animating a society. And obviously, I think the individual themselves would have charismatic traits as a personality, but that charisma is only useful if it's within a social context that allows them to harness these social forces that are tied to this issue of authority. And their charisma is derived from their, like I said, the charisma is derived from their association with this authority. And I think that's a very important
Mais uma
point
vez a imagem congelou.
to make. Is, are you all still hearing me okay?
Yes, for me, the I can see you very well. I don't know.
So,
If,
okay.
Rafael,
Okay.
I guess is your image that is freezed.
No, I just heard someone talking in the background, so I wasn't sure if anyway. Sorry, I'll just keep going.
Yeah.
So, right. So then there's the theory of charisma, but so basically, if we go back to this idea of legitimate authority, what Durkheim's work allows us to understand is the consent of the ruled. So why do people voluntarily submit to the rule of a politician or a government or a certain institution like the church? Why do they consent? Why do they allow themselves to be a part of this? Durkheim allows us to explain that. But he also allows us to understand how, I guess if you want to say this is sort of Durkheim's theory of domination, but how Durkheim allows us to also understand how people can be, or how this moral authority can be instrumentalized by politicians. So if a politician has this charisma due to their association with a moral authority, then they can use that association, they can use the emotional attachments people have to particular ideas. They can use those in order to pass certain legislation or to implement certain policies. And there they get, and thereby the policies or the laws that they wish to propose, they gain legitimacy, and so they pass, and so they're implemented. And I think that's also very important to note the potential instrumentalization by political actors of this authority for political ends. And right, so I've also mentioned the importance of moral authority to studying conflict. I guess I'll mention very briefly a little bit more in my book. This is exactly what I do. And in my book, the idea of legitimate authority is a central concept. And so what I did in the book is I used this idea of legitimate authority. I tried to see how politicians legitimate the laws that they wanted to pass, or how do other actors, political actors, legitimate their behavior. And sometimes this includes political violence. You have right-wing extremist violence and left-wing extremist violence. And so I wanted to understand, how did these actors justify and legitimate their behavior, so oftentimes violent, against their political opponents. And the justification was very often moral. And when the justification is moral in this sense, the justification always goes back to this idea of legitimate authority. And so people, the political actors, were defending their pure sacred from the impure sacred, which was embodied by the political opponents. And so I guess an example would be the Antifa or the Autonomen. They would attack the AfD in Germany, which is a right-wing populist party. So they would attack them, burn cars or break windows of restaurants and things like that. And they would do that because they were defending what I analyze as their pure sacred of human dignity, their own version of human dignity, and they were protecting that against the AFD, which they saw as racist, xenophobic, nationalistic, etc., etc. And all of those were, to be racist, xenophobic, etc., those were forms of impure sacred. Those were forms of evil that threaten the existence of the pure sacred of universal human dignity, understood in sort of a communistic way. And so they always legitimated their violence in moral terms. We have to attack fascism, we have to attack racism and things like this. And so if you look at this through a Durkheimian framework, I mean, to me, it's the perfect framework to understand what's going on. And I'm not sure how far you would go with other paradigms, but anyway, I did it with Durkheim. I think I did. I think I did pretty good. So that's that. The third theme that I want to talk about is the theme of moral knowledge, and I should begin by saying that moral knowledge is a type of knowledge, but it is not the same thing as scientific or empirical knowledge. And Durkheim makes that distinction very clear in a number of texts he wrote later in his life about the distinction between science and scientific knowledge and moral or social knowledge. And scientific knowledge, of course, is it accurately describes the objective world, and it's factually true. And moral knowledge, on the other hand, is socially constructed. It varies from one society to the other, but at the same time, this moral knowledge still, even though it's socially constructed, even though it varies from group to group, it still produces truths, what people consider are truths. And these are truths that people take as objective knowledge. They base their lives, they live their lives off of these truths. And so for them, the truths, the moral truths that they hold, I think for them is, it constitutes a sort of moral reality, or they consider it to be objective knowledge, objectively true. And you could have any number of examples of moral claims that people make that they hold to be true, objectively so. And in my book, I talk about, and this goes back to this idea of the creation of ideas through ritual, the creation of ideas through the sui generis process of social interaction. And what you end up having is, in my book, I call it moral epistemic networks. And these are basically networks of integrated concepts and ideas about morality, about what is right and wrong, good and evil, how people should behave, what rules people should follow, what kind of punishment people should receive if they don't follow the rules. This is a moral epistemic framework, and I think that's a very, I mean, it's a groundbreaking idea that Durkheim had way back 100 years ago. And there are so many parallels here between Durkheim and someone like Michel Foucault. And I guess this is also kind of what annoys me about philosophy and political science, sociology, is people always talk about Foucault, the construction of knowledge, the social construction of knowledge and things like this. But they won't talk about Durkheim, even though Durkheim, arguably, he has almost the exact same ideas as Foucault, and he has them 50 years before Foucault. But it is what it is. You could, I mean, the idea of Durkheimian, this idea of the Durkheimian social construction of reality, of knowledge, of social knowledge, and the Foucauldian idea of episteme, for example, there's so many parallels there. But I still think that Durkheim is better than Foucault, and I guess I should also mention very quickly that in my chapter I draw also off of Gabriel Abend. He's done quite a lot of important work on his idea of the moral background. From what I can tell, the moral background is basically the same kind of idea of the Foucaultian episteme. It's this background knowledge of ideas and truths that allow for moral knowledge to be possible. And so Durkheim fits within this context very well. But I think Durkheim, he takes us farther than both Gabriel Abend and Michel Foucault, because both Gabriel Abend and Foucault, what they're doing is they're limiting themselves to studying the structure of ideas, the structure of these networks. They're not explaining them. And what I mean by that is it's kind of the same critique I have of the strong program. You can describe the structure, the cultural structures animating society, animating the thought of groups in society, but you're still limiting it only to sort of an analysis of the ideas. If you want to understand why the ideas are causally efficacious, you have to go back to the ritual. You have to go back to the emotions, the emotional attachments people have to these ideas. And that's where the Durkheimian element comes in, and I think provides a more detailed analysis. And there's also the idea of genealogy. That's also a Foucauldian idea, genealogy. But again, I find that in Durkheim, Durkheim also studies the historical development of ideas of morality. And so I think the idea of genealogy is also very compatible with Durkheimian sociology. And in my book, in the second chapter, the chapter after the theoretical chapter here, I do a genealogy of morality of post-war Germany. And I show different shifts within the moral consciousness of Germany, especially within the wake of the Holocaust and World War II, and how those experiences sort of transformed Germany's moral consciousness and led to deep transformations within Germany's moral background, which led to different moral decisions, moral ideologies in Germany. And so I do that, and again, this is all very Durkheimian, what I'm doing, I think, even though I'm drawing off of different authors. But the question of objective meaning still remains. You can identify these networks of moral truths, but can you objectively identify the meaning of the moral truths, what the truths mean? And I mentioned that in my introduction. I mention it here again, but it's because now I'm going to go into the what I hope to be a solution with the Durkheimian ideal type. And this will be the last of the themes that I discuss before we get into the discussion. But the Durkheimian ideal type, he lays out, I would say, the most explicit form, the most explicit articulation is in the conclusion to the elementary forms of religious life. where he talks about types of thought and action that press upon the individual mind uniformly. And what he's talking about there basically is ideal typical collective representations, which have been infused with a great amount of sui generis collective energy. And because of that, people have a high degree of emotional attachment to these collective representations. And because they are such important features of a society, they act as a model for people to follow. And so that's what I mean when you can say they're ideal typical. And the kind of ideal types that I discuss in my chapter are the moral ideals. And I specifically address one type of moral ideal. There are very many different moral ideals that Durkheim discusses, but the moral ideal that I discuss in the most detailed and the one that was the most relevant to the subjects that I was studying is the ideal type of the community, the ideal community. What is the vision of the perfect community? And I think in different traditions, they give it these types of moral ideas different names. Maybe in the Marxist tradition, they talk about utopia, or if people are studying totalitarianism, they talk about a utopia. That's just a moral ideal in a Durkheimian sense. It's the idea of a perfect society where everything is great, good has vanquished evil, and this is a very powerful ideal. And when you look at it in a political context, it is the idea that sort of is a driving force to motivate political actors to gain state power as a way to realize or to make a concrete reality their ideal vision for society. And so I think this is a very important concept in Durkheim's work to the study of politics and morality. And it's also important to note that within these moral ideals that I articulate, there's a concept of justice. And then you're relating back into philosophical discussions. And this idea of justice, I think, is one of the key features of a moral ideal. And in my book, I identify 4 different ideal types that are found in, I would argue, all Western societies. You have sort of deconstructive multiculturalism, you have political liberalism, constitutional patriotism, and then you have different forms of nationalism, the ethnocultural nationalism or biological nationalism. And so I detail all of that in the book. And I think this is very interesting, very important insight that we gain with Durkheim, because there's so many philosophical debates about multiculturalism, about the nation. What do these terms mean? What kind of society do we want to live in? Oftentimes these debates are very normative. And to me, I don't think there's really much I could have added to those theoretical debates about multiculturalism and the nation. There's already been so much that's said. So what I did is I looked at basically how these debates tie into social reality. How do they tie into concrete actions by political actors? And that's what I did in my book. I identified these 4 different ideal types of society, and I saw how different groups of actors were all pursuing these ideal types, these moral ideals, and how these moral ideals sort of structured the moral conflict that you saw in Germany, how they structured the society itself into different groups with different values and different competing political claims. And I will say that these ideals, I found them all in Germany, but I think that the ideal type, the ideal typical, I'm not sure what you'd say, the articulation, these four different concepts of the community, they're found all across the West, in the United States, in Canada, in France, in Sweden. You have these four basic ideal types, these moral ideals that are all competing with each other in society. And I would venture, I mean, probably these same ideals, moral ideals, are found in different non-Western societies as well. But I don't know, that's a question for someone else. And so I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with Rogers Brubaker, but my ideal type kind of pushes against that. He's very popular in political science. He wrote a very famous book about France and Germany and immigration laws and how they have different models of citizenship, and it's very Weberian. And I'm not sure if anyone wants to ask about that later. I can go into that, but basically my Durkheimian analysis, I think, is more nuanced than oftentimes what you find with what is in the dominant form of thinking in political science. So, but then again, and I'll end on this note, this comes back to the question of objective, empirically identifiable meaning. So how does the ideal type that I've articulated here, how does that solve the issue of objective, empirically identifiable meaning? So if we say that there are these collective representations that are act in an authoritative and that are ideal types for groups of actors, we can say that we can determine them or identify them in the first sense by looking at its institutional prominence. So how is the ideal type collective representation represented in various institutions? For example, the state, in schools, in churches, the media, in visual culture. How is this collective representation presented to the public? And so there we can get an idea of its prominence and how ideal typical it is. Also, what group it's speaking to, what group has attachments to it, emotional attachments to it. We can also look at how the collective representation is communicated by authoritative actors. So, for example, the Pope, religious authorities, politicians, celebrities, artists. How do they use certain collective representations? What message are they communicating with these collective representations? I think those first two get to the issue of objectively and empirically identifying the existence of an ideal typical collective representation. So then the next question is, well, how do we empirically identify the meaning of this collective representation? And my argument is that you can understand what it means by doing sort of a thick description of contextualizing as best as possible the collective representation itself. You can also simply quote the actors. And in my book, oftentimes I just quote politicians I quote their speeches, because they say very often, very explicitly, the moral values that they embody, the moral values that they are pursuing, and they lay it out very specifically. So I simply quote what they say, and I also look at group manifestos, other types of speeches, and I think when you do that, you can get a very good idea of what exactly their message is. And then that comes back to this question of, well, is the meaning objectively identifiable? And I would say it has to be. And this is kind of a logically necessary point, because if the meaning is not objectively identifiable, collective action would be impossible. So if you have a collective representation whose meaning is contested or can be interpreted in different ways by different individuals, then it will not be a group object. It will not be a communal object, and no one will. It will basically be meaningless. It will not be able to communicate any message to any other individuals. And if that were the case, then there would be no social action possible. So the meaning has to be objectively identifiable to some extent, and to the extent that the meaning is objectively identifiable by other social actors, the sociologist or philosopher or whoever should be able to reconstruct that meaning and present it to a reader as an object of analysis. And that doesn't mean that one collective representation has only one meaning. Collective representation can have multiple meanings. It only means that the meaning of the collective representation, the message that it is communicating, is something that is not determined by the individual. It is not something up for interpretation necessarily. It is something that is bound by structures of interpretation, and it should be possible to identify those structures in an objective way. And so that's sort of that's maybe a little bit of a side issue. I didn't really address this issues explicitly in the first chapter in the book, but I think it's a very interesting topic, and if anyone wants to pursue it later, we certainly can. But I would say that it is related to my objective to defend the Durkheimian sociological project, to defend the idea of to defend basically Durkheimian structuralism and the idea that social facts are objectively existing objects of social reality that can be studied in an objective way, in a scientific way. And so that's what I'm trying to do. And so this whole issue of hermeneutics is a part of that project. So but anyway, that's quite a lot of talking. I've done enough of that, so I'm done with the presentation of the paper, and we can, I guess, open the floor to other people now who have responses or things to say.
Thanks, Paul. Now we move on to Sebastian Raza. Sebastian is a PhD at the University of Cambridge. I met him in a debate that we did together around the excellent book by Daniel Chernilu, a Chilean sociologist and philosopher, the book Debating Humanities Towards a Philosophical Sociology. Raza organized a dossier in the Distinction Journal of Social Theory about this book. This dossier appeared in Spanish in the journal Teorían, Revista de Ciências Sociales, of which Sebastian Raza is editor. I invite you to read it. Sebastian, I thank you once again for the invitation. Raquel, do you want to say anything first?
Of course, thanks, Paul. We have a lot to discuss based on what you presented. And Sebastian, it's a great honor to receive you in our Durkheimian Center. It's the first, but I hope it's not the last time that you meet with us here. So I'm looking forward to your debate, and thank you very much for accepting this invitation.
Thank you, Raquel, and thank you, Andre, for your kind words. And thank you for the invitation to debate this paper. Also, thank you, Paul, for such a wonderful presentation. I find it very interesting. I'm also very interested in the sociology of moralities. But as a disclaimer, I have to start saying that I am not a Durkheim scholar, and perhaps what I have to say, I believe, is not really alien to Durkheim. I believe that my main thesis, that I will state it shortly, is complementary to Durkheim, and Durkheim can easily be taken in that way. The thesis that I want to defend is that the study of morality in the Durkheim way could be complemented in a good way if we take seriously what I call a project of a sociology of symbolic forms. Of course, this is a reference to Cassirer, and I believe that it allows us to still hold an objective, like it still allows us to accept that morality exists intersubjectively, perhaps, and is not only a subjective projection, but it is not as naturalistic as the Durkheimian project. So I want to start by commenting on the fact that I find it very interesting how Paul takes the bull by its horns, so to speak, by accepting that Durkheim sociology is written with an ambivalence more than anything. That is, on the one hand, to hold a positivist view and combine it more or less successfully with an idealist view on the moral fact. This is very interesting because, taken to its most positive consequences, it allows us to say that the moral fact or morality is objective. It exists outside individuals, is not only the result of projections, but it is the condition of possibility, so to speak. And at the same time, it allows us to talk about it as a dimension of consciousness, as something that is constitutive of how people reflect, how they see themselves, how they talk about their society. So in the end, we end up with an anti-subjectivist take on morality, in which it not only operates in terms of sanctions, but it has certain, that Durkheim finds it in rituals, certain kind of causal efficient way by which ideals are created, by which categories of thought emerge, and so on and so forth. It is a realm that it is, as Paul says in his paper, of and in nature, and it operates in terms of causes rather than reasons, so to speak. It is a space of causes, it's not a space of reasons. And there is an interesting phrase where Paul talks about that, in which that will be important by the end of my presentation, that I want to read, that is in the page 19 in the version I got. He says, this is to say that their truths, moral truths, are presented and accepted by adherents more or less at face value. The truth of the claims is self-reflexive, and no justification is required for these statements to be taken as true. Any rationalization of the position comes after the fact. The power of these truths comes from their association with the pure sacred and moral authority, to which individuals have emotional attachments that are created in collective ritual and which present themselves in a non-tautological way to adherents as transcendence, as presence, as fundamental grounds. The acceptance of ideas as morally true lies, as with the legitimacy of the moral authority, in the sui generis social forces that animate them, of which the individual is not conscious. For this reason, in order to study moral truth, the sociologist must in turn study a society's representation, collective representations, as well as the ritual process that give them their force. Up to this point, this is the upshot of Durkheim's holding positivism and idealism. But now I want to talk about the down parts and how it can be complemented by a sociology of symbolic forms. I believe that when one poses this idea of combining positivism and idealism, one ends up in an ambivalence. What is the ambivalence? That morality is, on the one hand, an object of rational description. But on the other hand, it comes at cost of being an emotional process of attachment of which the individual is not conscious and so on and so forth. And this, to me, seems to deny the basic fact that individuals move within their social life between the position of observers and participants in the social world. There are some symbolic forms that allow for more detached ways of interpretation, of justification, and of acting. And I believe that the problem of having this reductive view that reduces morality to rituals and binaries comes from the fact of seeing in rituals only causal mechanisms. And here's where I will try to explain what I mean by that. And it is famously, Durkheim focuses on rituals to explain causally the emergence of symbols and later categories of thought. But I believe that Durkheimian scholars need to engage with contemporary scholarship on rituals, not only in the way that Jeffrey Alexander has done, that is that with cultural anthropology, but more importantly with the cognitive sciences and with evolutionary biology. And in this, I'm referring to the works of people like Merlin Donald and Michael Tomasello. They also focus on rituals, but not only as the causal mechanisms behind ideals or symbols, but more importantly, as part of a long recursive process that is of phylogenesis and ontogenesis of concepts of thought. In this process, they acknowledge that rituals are the elementary form of later more developed and complex forms of thought, in which the gesture gives way to the symbol and the symbol gives way to the concept, and this makes an effective difference in the way in which we experience the world. It is a process that involves emergence of myths, of narratives, but also the demythologization of symbols, the emergence of theoretical speech, of writing, of books, and so on and so forth. And here I want to bring this idea of abstract symbolic forms to concrete symbolic forms. And it is interesting that Durkheim himself focuses on religions that are totemic, right? And it involves accepting that there is a big difference between a religious form that has the totemic ritual at its center and a religious form in which there is a reference to a book, right? In which the rituals involve the reference to the book and the book conceived as a revealed word. So it must acknowledge that there are differences between in the ways in which the sacred appears and is experienced and is justified in the social world. It must involve taking also into account the difference between an axial and a non-axial religion. And what I find very interesting is that this is what many sociologists are telling us today, people like Hans Joas and people like Robert Bellat. They are explaining us how at the center of morality or of religion, there are rituals, but these rituals take different forms depending on how the hermeneutic experience of the sacred is configured, so to speak. And it is very interesting because this means taking also the secularization thesis very seriously, taking the idea that the sacred appear in secular forms, that morality, of course, can have a reference to an ideal of the sacred, but that this sacred is not necessarily transcendent. And I believe that this is very important in the case of civil religions, where the text to which we make reference in our experience of the world is not taken as a revealed word, but is taken as a word that is written by us here and now. So we can talk about post-axial moralities or ideals of community. And what I find interesting is that this is kind of the argument that people like Jeffrey Alexander seem to reject from the outset. They tirelessly remind us that our modern prejudices perhaps don't allow us to see that the sacred is in the modern world, that our hearts and our moral emotions is configured by taboos and totems, but he refuses to really analyze concretely what are the form of the sacred, the effective forms of the sacred in each iteration. And I think that this is important and this is relevant for Paul project because it allows us to say that the four moral ideals are not only four different binaries of pure sacred and pure sacred and impure sacred, but effectively are four different ways in which the nation is experienced. For instance, what he calls patriotic constitutionalism in reference to Habermas, we should ask what are the effects upon moral experience and upon moral knowledge and justification of the fact that in the configuration of community and the experience of community, we refer to a text that is written by us here and now. Or for instance, the biological nation is necessarily a nation that axializes or verticalizes race and biology and makes a different experience of community and morality, right? And it can also ask how the destructive multiculturalism involves certain hermeneutics of suspicion, right? Certain way of justifying which we need to unmask the other to show them how they are being cruel. And I think that in the end, we end up in the question that Paul wants to raise, that it is how to study sociologically the background, how to study sociologically what we conceive as the moral background that is a intersubjective dimension of social life, right? And here I perhaps will turn into in a bit to philosophy. And I think that famously after Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty, the idea of the background has had at least two families of interpretation. In the one family of interpretation that is like the kind of a soul-cryptic interpretation of the background, it is a causally efficacious dimension that configures or gets wired in the mind of individuals and defines or determines how they think, how they feel, how they judge. But in the end, it requires no justification. And the way in which people's actions affect them are also explained by causes. Paul in his paper also is doing the same, right? Like when he talks about the feedback loop and refers to Kit Sawyer, he's also saying like the background affects individuals through some sort of causal mechanisms, and individuals affect the background through other sort of causal mechanism. And we need to identify them. And I think that is okay. That is the one family of interpretations of the background. The other family of interpretations of the background take it as conditions of possibility of meaning that can be justified and that are not only structurally, let's say they are not structurally, they don't have one structural shape, but they have concrete symbolic forms. In some of them, they involve only rituals that are enacted. In other, it involves rituals that are interpreted through reference to a text. In others, they can involve a more scientific attitude through it, right? So the idea is that the different symbolic forms that are there in concrete backgrounds allow for more detached or more emotionally attached ways of justification. It allows for different forms of knowledge. It allows of different forms of experience, right? It is a phenomenological, hermeneutical, and semiotic account that we have to give about concrete backgrounds. And what I find interesting is that when Paul refers to Gabriel Abend, he rejects what he calls metaethics, and I don't remember the other one. He mentions the dimensions that Gabriel is focusing in, and he says that there are two dimensions that he prefers to bracket out, so to speak. One is the dimension of metaethics, and the other is the dimension of methods and arguments. But I think that these are precisely the two dimensions that are addressed once we focus on backgrounds as symbolic forms. We start seeing how they allow for more detached ways or impersonal ways of justification or arguments, how they allow for, so to speak, for different types of experience of moral experience of community or of the sacred. And I believe that, I just want to close this, I don't want to talk much. I believe that this is very important because it allows us to see that democracies or modern democracies are not just in a play of evil and good or sacred and profane or pollution and purity, but more importantly, that the evils of democracy are figured. Like I think that in this I'm making reference to Paul Ricoeur. The symbolisms of evil as the symbolism of sacred, they figure what is the sacred and what is evil. Democracies are not only polluted, but can be performed as, I don't want to use the word perform, but can be figured as being captured, for instance. For instance, I believe that populism is not really a phenomenon of pollution, but really of figuring democracies as captive by an elite that need to be recovered by a people. So what I mean is that once we study symbolic forms, we can see how not only binaries are at play, but also figuration of symbols and also justification of concepts, different ways in which symbols do operate in the social world, different ways in which the community is experienced as something sacred that is transcendent and axial, or as something that is created here and now by a book that is written by us. And all of these things, all of these symbolic forms give way to different ways of justifying, of knowing the world, and in last instance, of authority. I believe that the study of legitimacy and authority has to go through a process of the study of symbolic forms, which which type of legitimacy is possible within this symbolic form, which type of authority is possible, or which types of authority are possible within this other symbolic form. And yeah, I believe that is my main idea, that I will just repeat by the end, that is that the Durkheim analysis, if it moves from a view of rituals, from causal mechanisms, as part of a philo and ontogenetic long process of symbolic forms, it can gain a more phenomenological and hermeneutical take on how backgrounds operate. And that can be important for the concrete study of social forms such as democracy, as I tried to make a brief comment on. So that is what I will have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for this fine and sophisticated reflection in a perfect English. We will certainly want to listen to you even more and in other times. Muchas gracias, Sebastian. És equatoriano, hablas espanhol, então hablo portunhol também. É uma possibilidade também de falar em espanhol em outros momentos em Brasil. Raquel, please speak about it and pass the floor.
I believe Paul should make his comments before we listen to Carlos, right? And it was great, Sebastian, a lot to think about, because when you address those questions to Paul, I keep thinking about them too. So maybe after we can debate all together, but now we can hear Paul to follow his comments.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Sebastian, for taking the time to read the text and to give me such detailed comments. I think I guess you'd say you understand very well this idea about the feedback loop, and that also sort of ties into the idea of the ideal type collective representation. And so you have these collective representations that act in an authoritative way, that influence people's behavior, but in turn their behavior sort of transforms in some respect the way they perceive the authority, and so there's this feedback loop. I think that it's important to note also that this idea of the feedback loop, I made sure I put it in because I think that's how Durkheim understood the process to go, but also because it is a way to preserve individual agency within a structuralist framework. And that's something that's often, an argument that's often levied against Durkheim or against structuralists generally, is that they have no place for individual agency. And so the feedback loop is an idea that allows for the preservation of individual agency within a structuralist framework. So that's just one point that I wanted to add that's, I think, very important to note. And so that sort of ties into this idea that individuals move between observation and action. And I guess I'm not really so sure about the ambivalence between idealism and positivism that you referenced. To me, I mean, Durkheim elaborates his view, and to me it makes perfect sense if you take it that social facts are constructed by humans. They're not the product of God, for example. Religion is not something divine, extra-worldly. It is something that is produced by humans through social interaction. Then you have to understand it as a product of nature. And if it's a product of nature, why would you not be able to study it as a science in a positivistic way, as as providing certain data points that you can study, that you can observe, but at the same time, I mean, these are ideas. And so, you know, I think often about, there's the Weberian tradition in the social sciences, where there's this sharp distinction between the natural sciences and the social sciences. The natural sciences describe the world as it is, objective truth, and with the social sciences, there's always sort of wrapped in this hermeneutics, and there is no completely objective account possible. And what you have with Durkheim is he also makes a distinction between the natural sciences, so science, scientific representations, and the social realm, the realm of moral judgment, the realm of social action. So Durkheim also makes that distinction, but Durkheim conserves for the social realm this possibility of a naturalistic outview. So even though the social world is fundamentally different from the natural world, and in the way in which it functions and how we observe it, it's still a part of the natural world, and objective knowledge of the social world remains possible. And because the social world is wrapped up so much with ideas, this just means that you would have objective knowledge of ideas. To me, that sounds like a perfectly reasonable proposition, and I'm not so sure, you know, how or why it would be ambivalent to make that claim. And of course, you know, Durkheim, it's always fascinating. I don't think he sits easily within any school of thought. He always combines different supposedly contrasting schools of thought. For example, rationalism and empiricism. In the elementary forms of religious life, he says, we're going to sort of look at rationalist ideas about morality, but within an empirical framework by looking at empirical data. And, you know, so many different supposedly contrasting schools of thought Durkheim manages to mesh together. And I'm not so sure, I don't see that so much ambivalent as, I just think it's one of Durkheim's strengths, really, is to cut across these supposedly contrasting categorizations. So I don't know if you would have any more detail to provide on that. And also the idea of this idea of, I think it's also very interesting what you say, that people's experiences of the sacred, for example, they're different. The way that the ritual experience unfolds is different depending on if the sacred text is written by humans, if it's a totem, if it's the Bible, if it's the Declaration of Independence. I think that's very interesting, and it's not something I would say I guess I developed somewhat a Durkheimian theory of political ideology in the book. And in this first chapter, I sort of developed the foundations of a Durkheimian theory of political ideology. In political science, I guess the person who does that, who's most often associated with that sort of analysis, is Eric Voegelin. And he makes a distinction between otherworldly religions and innerworldly religions. Otherworldly religions are religions where the sacred object is a divine being, like God or Yahweh. It's something from a different realm outside of human experience. And innerworldly religions are religions basically like political ideologies. So communism or National Socialism. These are ideologies that are created by humans that have their concepts are derived from the human world, the scientific world. And so he makes a distinction there. I didn't make that distinction because I didn't get to reading Eric Voegelin before I wrote the book, but it sounds very similar to kind of what you were mentioning. I'm not really that too familiar with all the literature that you wrote, that you mentioned about post-axial ritual, things like that. Obviously, it sounds very relevant. And I mean, I can't really comment too much on it because I don't know. I just don't know very much about it. And yeah. But I guess the last point is the idea of the background, the two different interpretations. And I'm not really sure. I mean, I view my own work as also preoccupied. I mean, there's the structure, and there's this feedback loop that you mentioned, but at the same time, I'm also very much interested in the conditions of possibility for moral knowledge. And these conditions of possibility go back to the sort of the foundational concepts that animate these moral epistemic networks, the sacred objects that they refer to, that individuals refer to. These, certain arguments just are not possible to be understood if people do not have if they don't share the same networks of concepts. So, and this can happen even with people who share the same social space. If you have a Nazi and a communist, and they try to debate each other about what kind of government or society they should live in, they're not going to agree. They will reject each other's arguments completely outright, and it's because they're not utilizing the same repertoire of concepts to construct their arguments. And so, in that sense, yeah, I think I'm also very much dealing with this issue of the conditions of possibility for arguments. And I'll also just lastly say, sort of defend myself, the whole idea of meta-ethics or methods and arguments. I don't think that's really quite so important, because when you go into the social world, you can have, for example, the Antifa people or deconstructionists, or people who say that there is no objective truth. Everything is subjective. Okay, that's a meta-ethical question. Is truth objective? Is it subjective? Or are they moral realists or skeptics? That's interesting. But when it comes to enacting policy, or when it comes to political behavior, so for example, if you have the Autonomen, the Antifa people, they don't believe in objective truth. They don't believe in objective moral reality, and that's their cognitive position. That's the argument. That's the form of argument that they make. But when it comes to political action, the fact that they don't believe in objective truth does not prevent them from engaging in acts of violence against people they disagree with. So when it comes to imposing their supposed moral relativism onto other people, they act as if they are moral realists. They act as if they have the objective moral truth. They act as if they know what the objective truth is. So you know, it doesn't, I'm just not so sure that that's really such a useful tool of analysis. To me, it's much more important to see what people actually do and with what degree of emotional intensity they do something. And again, the only way to, Gabriel Abben does not provide the tools to understand that, or to analyze this intensity with which people engage in activities. It's something that you get with Durkheim when you look at the interaction rituals, for example. And so that would be my response. I mean, I'm not sure if we keep going, or if we let you respond, or if the other person wants to go to comments now.
Thanks,
so
Paul.
I'm finished with my rebuttal, I guess.
Sebastian, if that's okay for you, we listen to Carlos now, and then we go to further debate. Is that all right? Okay. Thanks, Paul. And now we listen to Carlos Fabris. Carlos Fabris is a member of our Brazilian Center of Durkheim Studies. As André former introduced him, he just defended his master on Durkheim and Weber. So I'm looking forward to see the Carlos' thoughts, not just about Durkheim, but also about Paul's Weber, because somehow, Paul, you also have an interpretation about Weber, right? So I wanted to listen what Carlos has to say about it. Please, Carlos.
Thank you so much, Raquel. Yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity to be here discussing with Paul, reading his text, listening to his talk. Also, Sebastian, it's nice to meet you and hear also your argument. And yeah, a special thanks to the organization, Raquel, Renan, and André, for making it possible. Yeah, I really enjoyed reading to Paul's text. I think it's a really important theoretical interpretation of Durkheim. I think it keeps his spirit alive even more than a century after his death. So it's really interesting to see it being applied to social research and to contemporary problems. So yeah, I think we can keep this dialogue going in the future, and I really enjoyed reading and listening to you, Paul. Just a small introduction. As Raquel mentioned, I'm kind of a double agent here at the Durkheimian Center. I did my master's under Raquel's supervision, and I investigated not only the moral aspects of Durkheim's work, but also the moral aspects of Weber's work. And in the text, I notice all these connections that Paul's making between the two classical authors, and I think they are really interesting. And now in the talk, he went a bit further and explained a lot of these connections. So I'd like to focus on that. That's my main interest. And yeah, I think my main point is that I don't see so much of a opposition between the two of them, but more of an intersection. And I see in my research, I've seen in this moral aspect and the study of moral phenomena on how they are complementary in the sense that Durkheim's work, it revolves around the creation of moral phenomena, moral ideals, moral rules, and Weber is more interested in the consequences and how it develops in the modern society. So he's not focused on the creation of or on the ritual part that's so rich in Durkheim's work. So in that sense, I would say there are a lot of complements between the two, a lot of complementary aspects between the two of them. I have some questions that are they're more in the sense of asking you to develop a bit of this argument between the two classical authors. The first one would be on the concept of meaning. That's a really important concept in the interpretive sociology, in the Weberian sociology. And you mentioned now in your talk about the epistemological aspect of meaning, if it's possible to comprehend meaning objectively. But I was wondering, how does meaning, what role does it play inside of the Durkheimian theoretical scheme? Because in Weber, it's important part of action. It's the main aspect of action. And in Durkheim, you mentioned in your text that through rituals, it creates meaning, and that's a source of authority or moral authority. And that the collective representations are not projections of the reality, but the meaning and value is superadded and superimposed onto reality. And that's really interesting. And I was wondering if that's something you took from Alexander's approach, where meaning also plays an important part, or if it's possible to find this element in the Durkheimian sociology itself. I didn't get the references from your text, but I noticed that this part it comes from the elementary forms of religious life, and especially the part of the soul, the notion of the soul. And that's a doubt that I have, because in Weber it's central, and in Durkheim I never noticed, or I didn't read him that way, but I find it really interesting. And it's like I said, a more complementary approach. Yeah, the second element would be around the notion of authority and charisma. I was convinced by you that that Durkheim has some elements around authority that are that go further, as Weber did. That there are some limitations on this, on the origin and the source of authority and power in Weber. That would be. I agree with you, and I think that moral authority in Durkheim's work, it gives us other instruments and means to think the social reality. But I'm still not sure around the theory of charisma from Durkheim. When it's connected with, when it's derived from the moral authority, I think the individual character of charisma that's so important for Max Weber, it's a bit lost in this. And I hope to hear more about this theory of charisma. I know you spoke very briefly about it, but I would say that in the Weberian theory of charisma, this individual character is really important, and it's not anyone that connects with the moral authority, the values. It's this person has a specific agency or action character that's really important. And you mentioned the AfD leader, the Bjorn Höcke. Yeah, in that sense, like, what makes him so special? Why could he mobilize this charisma and have such an impact? I think that's when you read it to Durkheimian lens, that's not so clear for me. And also the final point of touch between Weber and Durkheim would be the ideal type. I noticed, I know you're gonna present a paper on the Canadian Sociological Association. We are sharing the same in this, where I'm presenting too the Durkheimian section, and I saw, and I was really interested in your work on the ideal type. And now you explain a bit further in the text. You mentioned a bit less, but I couldn't grasp how it differs, how in building this ideal types of nation, and how it differs from a Weberian ideal type. Does it add another layer of complexity? I've noticed on the conclusion of the elementary forms, I noticed that he mentioned the types, but I never went as far to think of a Durkheimian ideal type. And if you could, I would like to hear more about that. And yeah, actually, I have another question that's more like of curiosity. Since you investigated the migrant crisis in 2015 and all this power dynamics, the nation, the concepts of nation, I was wondering if you could, I know it's not your main research, but if you could give us some insight or some remarks on the Ukrainian situation now, because it involves a lot of questions about nation, about power, politics, and charisma as well from leaders. And yeah, I think that would be all. I thank you very much for your presentation and for your text. I'm really looking forward to reading the whole book now. It's a subject that interests me very deeply. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Carlos. I believe we can now have a quick answer from Paul, and then we pass the floor to Carlos first and then Sebastian for their final remarks. Okay?
And I also have questions, but after.
Okay. And Raquel, please.
You think that I should make my questions now, or we listen to Paul first?
And Raquel, do the closing, the final consideration and closing.
But okay, just let me ask you just two quick questions, because they are very connected to those from Carlos. Is that right? So I guess Paul can gather all of them. Paul, actually, there are three very objective questions. First, it's very interesting how you bring moral theory to think political theory. But my question is, you deal also with this more political side of Durkheim writings, for instance, his notion of state and etc. Because you bring moral representations to think about nationalisms and etc. But what is your opinion about Durkheim's own idea about the role of state and how to balance individual, family, or secondary groups and the state? I mean, his own political vision, his own political point of view, what he defended as the best solution, the best arrangement. And this is also connected to the second question that I see that you make a very objective, explicative, not normative approach. You don't follow this path in Durkheimian work, but he has a very important and deep normative side of his work. And I believe you are somehow aligned to Gabriel Aben's position and has this more descriptive view. So somehow I missed this more committed approach that Durkheim allows us to do. I would like you to comment on that. Why this is your choice and etc. And the third point is, I understand that you use the ideal type in a Durkheimian way. But this is a comment, but also perhaps a suggestion. I guess this can create a great confusion with Weberian concept, because in Weber, this is also a very traditional concept. I would like to talk with you about the possibility of slightly changing the idea of ideal type in order to prevent this confusion. And I guess this will bring some more strength to your argument, because you are suggesting a very different approach on that. And perhaps using the same word would make your argument maybe weak, because once you read this is in a fast way, not paying a lot of attention, this can create some confusion. So those are my three arguments. I would like to hear you about that. That's it.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll start with Carlos's questions. I guess that some of it's intertwined. The first question about the concept of meaning. What does Durkheim? What place does it have in Durkheim's sociology? And I guess in this sense, it's maybe somewhat regrettable that Durkheim wasn't more explicit on this issue of meaning and the importance of meaning in society. And maybe it would have been something he developed in his last book on morality. I'm not really sure, but I would say it's a fundamental element of Durkheim's later work. And especially, and I mentioned it in my introduction, if you look at section 3 of the conclusion to elementary forms of religious life, he talks about the formation of the concept. Well, what is that? I mean, what is that exactly? He's talking about the formation of language through social processes, language as a sui generis social fact, and that's how I see it. And I guess, I don't know, I mean, maybe Durkheim should have quoted Saussure, or I mean, I guess the language aspect wasn't maybe quite as developed when he was writing, but I would say that this idea of meaning is a central feature of his sociology, and especially when by the time you get to the elementary forms of religious life, it's I mean, just even the idea of a collective representation. And already back in the rules of sociological method, he was already describing society as basically a set of ideas. And in the new preface, the second preface he wrote in 1901, he described society as essentially being composed of collective representations. And I mean, what is a collective representation? It's something that's infused with meaning. It communicates a message of some sort. And so then you mentioned that the quote about the super adding of meaning onto reality, it isn't just in elementary forms, it's also in his essay from Sociology and Philosophy about moral judgments of reality. What is it called? Judgments of reality and judgments of value. That's right. Judgments of reality and judgments of value. And there he's also talking about how meaning and value is projected onto reality and by the human sociological process. And so I get that. I didn't really get that idea very much from Jeffrey Alexander. I got it from Durkheim himself. And I should also add, I wrote my master's thesis on Nietzsche and Durkheim and the death of God. And Nietzsche is kind of, a lot of people say that Nietzsche is a precursor to Weber. And I see a lot of parallels between Nietzsche and Weber. And so my master's thesis was also kind of a process of combining opposites, if you will. But already, I mean, yeah, it's to me, it's quite obvious that meaning is an inherently important feature of his sociology, at least in the later part where he focuses about collective representations. The question about charisma and authority, there I would just have to refer you to what Durkheim himself says. There are some. I mean, it's not very developed. There are a couple paragraphs where Durkheim discusses it. There's a footnote in the Rules of Sociological Method where he talks about the way in which artists, or I guess he says men of genius or politicians, I guess, are able to use collective representations to their own ends. And there's also a passage in the Elementary Forms where he comes back to this idea, and he talks about politicians or holy religious figures. And here's the quote: they fulfill, or they speak to the deepest aspirations, and they present themselves as the means of fulfilling these aspirations. And so in that sense, he's talking about how individual politicians or artists or celebrities themselves become collective representations, authoritative collective representations, or if you want, even ideal types in some sense. And he talks about how this happens with princes, nobles, and political leaders. And so that's, I mean, maybe some people would look at that and see it as kind of a throwaway line, a throwaway paragraph. It's not so central to what Durkheim is doing in Elementary Forms. But you have there, if you connect those passages to the rest of what Durkheim is talking about, the ritual process, there I think you have a full-fledged theory of charisma. I'm not the only one. Jeffrey Alexander, Edward Tiryakin have written about it. Edward Tiryakin actually wrote an article where he compares Weber and Durkheim on charisma. And yeah, I mean, I don't think with Weber, as you mentioned, it's more the personal attributes of the individual that's important. And with Durkheim, he puts more emphasis on the social processes. And I don't think that I don't know if, I mean, it raises a very interesting question, because, you know, how important exactly is the personal charisma of an individual? If you take European royalty, for example, in England, they're presented as a very important part of English society. You can say that they have all of this charisma, so to say, because they're the royal family, because they occupy this prominent position that has a deep symbolism attached to it in English society. But I mean, honestly, are members of the royal family individually very charismatic people? Is that why people are attracted to them? Or is it simply because they hold the symbolic title of king or queen, which thereby confers upon them this collective sui generis energy? I think what Durkheim is saying is actually very interesting in those cases where in some cases, it really is the case that pretty much anyone could be in a particular role, and they could just play the very basic requirements and receive a charisma simply by the fact that they occupy a position in a particular institution. When you're talking about politicians who are active, who are getting votes, obviously you can be, charisma is a very important feature, but I don't think it's sufficient, because you can have a very charismatic politician, but if they're arguing for something that is a very unpopular policy or a very unpopular idea, it doesn't matter how much charisma, personal charisma they have, they'll never be successful in generating a collective movement of people and getting a large following, simply because the idea that they're pursuing isn't very important or very, very popular. So I think there that the idea of sacred is important in that sense. Of course, it depends on what you're studying. If you're talking about a cult leader who's recruiting people and who's relying solely on their own individual charisma, I suppose in that case Weber would be more appropriate. But if you're talking about a political process, a very large collective process, which depends on the consent of those participating in a large movement, I would say Durkheim is probably more relevant. But I don't know. I'll talk about Ukraine. I mean, I'm not really sure. I've kind of stopped following politics on a day-to-day basis in Germany so closely. When I was doing my research for my thesis, I was doing much more intensive research on exactly what was going on. In Germany, or Europe more generally, I mean, as far as I can tell, the Ukraine refugees are they're being accepted. There's very broad support for Ukraine in Europe and in the West more broadly, which itself, you could look at from a Durkheimian perspective as forms of the pure and impure sacred, a sort of moral binary there of Ukraine and Russia. There's obviously something there to say sociologically, from a cultural sociological perspective, and yeah, I'm not doing that right now. So, but I'll talk about the ideal type because it ties on to what both you and Raquel said. So what I'm doing with the ideal type is, I think there are important differences between Durkheim and Weber. With Durkheim, the Durkheimian ideal type that I am elaborating, or that Durkheim himself articulates, is the idea of basically he's talking about social norms. So there's social norms that have their collective representations with sui generis energy infused into them, and these representations act in an authoritative way on individuals from the outside. And so they're basically social norms. They're social norms that have influence over people. And of course, you have Durkheim's whole theory of collective ritual that explains how the ideal type collective represent. It's very different from Max Weber, who had the ideal type in Max Weber is sort of constructing models of different features of social life, social systems, based on an empirical study of how those systems worked, and then using them for comparative purposes. It seems more tied to methodological, the creating of concepts that are useful for methodological comparative purposes. Whereas with Durkheim, it's essentially, we're talking about social norms. So I think that's really the main difference. And so I understand that I'm sort of taking the concept, the word from Max Weber. But, you know, I'm just sort of looking at the way the social sciences and philosophy are structured. And especially in political science, you know, it's Max Weber, Max Weber, Max Weber, Max Weber. All the time people are talking about, oh, I did an ideal type of this. I don't care. I'm not a Weberian. Why aren't you doing Durkheim? That's my question. Why isn't anyone doing Durkheim? Why am I the only one doing Durkheim? So I guess I'm explicitly kind of taking or stealing the concept from Weber, because it's already within the social sciences, it's already such a well-known concept, the ideal type. Well, what if we say that the ideal type isn't necessarily just Weberian, it's also Durkheimian. There's a Durkheimian ideal type. So that's sort of a way I see you can sort of wedge Durkheim in and create a space where you can sort of add Durkheim into a discussion where he is relevant. I don't know if it creates confusion. I would say that's probably good, because then people will be forced to understand, well, what is the Durkheimian ideal type? Because otherwise, I just have the feeling that if I came up with a certain term for Durkheim that's unique to Durkheimian sociology, people will just ignore it. And people have been doing that for 100 years. Ever since Durkheim was writing, they just ignore whatever he says. It doesn't matter if what he says is directly relevant to what they're saying. He's just ignored. So I figure, you know, if I can take a concept that's already well established in the social sciences, and I guess kind of like a pirate, you know, I take it, I use it for my own purposes, and because people recognize what the ideal type is, when you start talking about the ideal type, I think they'll probably be more interested in what you're saying. And then you'll tell them, well, I'm actually doing Durkheimian sociology. Well, then, you know, it's kind of like a bait and switch. And so I look at it as, I mean, it's justifiable using Durkheim's own terminology to use the term ideal type. And I also think it has a strategic reason to do that. I can't really think of any, I mean, I also don't understand why, just because Max Weber used a term, if Durkheim has basically the same terminology, why does Durkheim have to take second place to Max Weber? I don't understand. But if you have, I mean, if you have an alternative way of articulating it, I'm happy to hear it. I'm just trying to find ways to make Durkheim more popular in the social sciences, and one way I guess that I've found to do that is to show how Durkheim and Weber are very complementary, so to speak. But anyway, going back to the other questions from Raquel, I actually have written an article. I mean, I'm not sure if you've read it, where I discuss Durkheim's role. I mean, what Durkheim's normative vision of the role of the state is in a modern society within the context of the cult of the individual. And so I've written an article about that. I published it a couple of years ago, and I'm happy to send you the link if you're interested. And basically what I argue is that Durkheim develops essentially political liberalism. I mean, again, it's just, it's so silly. I think it's silly because Durkheim is so relevant to so many different conversations. And he's a precursor to so many of these ideas that these philosophers have 150, 100 years after Durkheim. And they think that they're such geniuses. They're so struck by revelation that they have come up with these great ideas, and no one else. But Durkheim is there, and he already did it, and he gets no recognition. And this is a good example because Durkheim, with the cult of the individual and the normative role of the state in society, what he's basically saying is political liberalism. He's basically saying the exact same thing that John Rawls says about 100 years after Durkheim. And, you know, it's also very comparable to constitutional patriotism as articulated by Jürgen Habermas, I think. And of course, you can articulate it in different ways. But there's a very good book, obviously, by Mark Cladis, A Communitarian Defense of Liberalism. And he also lays out Durkheim's normative vision, I guess, for the state. And there he also says very clearly that Durkheim is doing political liberalism just like John Rawls. And, you know, Mark Cladis wrote his book 2 years before John Rawls published his book on political liberalism. But John Rawls never mentions Durkheim. And I don't understand. It's one of the great tragedies, I think, of the social sciences. But anyway, I'm happy to send those references if you're interested. And
yes, please.
also, yes, I also do this whole idea of the normative work, of Durkheim's normative work, versus a strictly empirical or descriptive analysis. And I did want to, I mean, I will say that I think the civil sphere theory that was developed by Jeffrey Alexander, I think is basically a Durkheimian articulation. I mean, it's basically what you're talking about is this sort of mixing of normative analysis along with empirical analysis of political processes. And that's civil sphere theory. And from what I understand from civil sphere theory is basically, I mean, the normative framework that civil sphere theory works with is the same normative framework of political liberalism or constitutional patriotism. And it comes back to this idea of the cult of the individual from a Durkheimian perspective. I don't know if in the civil sphere theory so much, if they give quite so much credit to Durkheim as they should, but I would say that is an example of the normative kind of work that you were talking about. And in my chapter in my book, I take a more distanced perspective, and I guess I like Gabriel Abend. I'm simply descriptive. I try to understand the processes that are taking place, and I don't really take a normative position one way or the other. I'm just sort of there observing, and I'm analyzing the conflicts between different groups. And I mean, I did that, you know, I think there's a lot to say for doing that kind of empirical descriptive work without taking a side necessarily, because, you know, Western society, not just Germany, I mean, I guess also in Brazil, or I mean, in a lot of different places now, societies have become incredibly polarized. And if you want to, I mean, it comes back to that Levi-Strauss quote, right? If you want to change the world, you can't. You have to remove yourself from studying it, and so I didn't want to engage in increasing partisan or polarization. So I just tried to. I simply tried to study the world as it is, and yeah. But I just saw someone said we have to finish, so I'm not sure. I'll stop talking now, and I'll let whoever wants to speak next.
Thanks, Paul. We have to finish, and I believe we can now have final remarks, fast final remarks. Carlos first, and then Sebastian. Raquel do the closing. Carlos, please.
Yeah, I actually don't have much to comment. I appreciate Paul for the answer, and I think we can keep this dialogue going. I also would like to read this text that he mentioned from Charisma and Durkheim Weber. I'm really interested in that, and yeah, hopefully in another opportunity we can keep this dialogue going. Yeah, thank you so much also for the opportunity to debate, and yeah.
Thanks. Sebastian?
Thank you. I also want to keep it very brief, and what I would say is that I agree with Paul that it is that the obvious option is to say like, oh, morality is not something that comes from the sacred or something metaphysical, and it seems to be that it is therefore a natural process. But I think that the third option is to say that it is an intersubjective condition, it is an intersubjective reality that does not operate as a space of causes, but as a space of reasons or symbols or expressions. I think these are the two ways of seeing the background. One is to see it as a space of causes, the other one as a space of expressions that I think I was not clear. And I believe that if you take the second vision of the intersubjective reality, you can study how it has effectively different symbolic forms in which rituals and like, I think, let me put it better. I think that this way was open also by the way in which Marcel Mauss interpreted Durkheim. So like the central aspect of morality is an intersubjective reality, the gift, which has different shapes, different forms, and moves into different symbolic ways. And I think this is also the way in which Habermas interprets Durkheim, by which he says that we first have the communion of minds in rituals through the exchange of gestures, and somehow there are immanent processes that bring these ideals into a communication of reasons in a public sphere. And I believe that Durkheimian approach to morality will benefit a lot to have this kind of genetic account of how rituals move from some sort of gesture and totems to reasons and public spheres and institutions and books that are coded and that allow for even meta-pragmatic ways of referring to norms. And this precisely breaks what I call the ambivalence, because this allows us to see how people in their everyday life, normativity is not only an emotional process of attachment, but can also be a process by which they take the position of observers or a more detached position, right? I think that is just what I wanted to say, that I do believe that Durkheim himself, or the ways in which Durkheim has been taken by Mauss or by Habermas, allow for these kind of directions into analysis of symbolic forms of morality. Oh.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Raquel?
Yeah, just to thank everyone. I guess we have still a lot to talk about. Well, perhaps another day we can arrange another meeting so we can share with you what we are trying to do here in our center, because I guess there are lots of parts in common with your own work. We are trying to develop a research program on sociology of morality, and we are also trying to use Durkheimian theory to understand contemporary phenomena, perhaps following different paths than you, but putting those paths together, I guess, is always a way to make it stronger, right? You doesn't necessarily need to think the same way to build forces together, to put our researches and thoughts together. I think this is a great way to improve our understanding on a particular topic. But I think you have done a great work. And I also want to thank especially André for helping us with organizing everything in the name of the Brazilian Center of Durkheimian Studies. And once again, I also thank Sebastian Raza. It was a great pleasure, and I hope we keep in touch. Carlos, also thank you, and all the audience who followed us until this moment. Unfortunately, we have to turn off to keep the schedule. And I wish everyone a good day, and let's keep in touch.
Okay, I just wanted to add really quick, I sent links to 2 articles that I published. The first one is the one about the normative, Durkheim's normative account of democracy. And the second one is basically an elaboration of a lot of what I've talked about today in much more detail. And it also has some of the references to some of the articles, like Edward Tiryakian's study of charisma is in the second one there on the social fact in Durkheim's late work. So if you can look at that, people can also feel free to contact me by email if they have any other questions, if they want to stay in touch or have something to share. So I'm happy to do that.
Great, and I hope it was useful for you, Paul, to have this moment to talk about our paper, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you again to everyone, and also for inviting me. So we'll see what happens in the future with Durkheim.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Muitas graças. Muito obrigado. Tchau, tchau, pessoal. Bom dia para vocês.
Bom dia. Até mais.